are and our people.
Good day, everyone. I'm Fred Spiro, the Executive Director of the National Widows Organization. Our session today is Storing and Restoring. Every year, over 450,000 men in the United States are widowed. For many reasons, these men are left alone to suffer in silence and isolation. Today, Ted Bowman, noted author and educator, will share his insights about widowers narrating, which gives them a voice to help provide resiliency and hope. Ted, thank you for joining us today to share your insights with us.
Thank you, Fred, and good day to each of you. Thank you for joining the two of us. And as we talk about being a widower and how we are coping and living with this new title in our lives, or may not be that new for some of you, maybe something that you've been living with for some time. I hope that this can be quite practical and useful for you. And just to give you an overview of where we're going and then a bit more about me, I'm going to share a few slides just to help us get grounded around the use of stories and writing for part of our healing practices. Not that I expect each of you to do it in the way that I do, but just to explore how the words of others can prompt us to think about some of our own narratives, our own stories as we evolve. Then I will share a bit of the writing that I've done, just again to give you examples of the kind of storytelling that might be rich for you. And then I'm going to allow at least 15, 20 minutes for questions and discussion. We'll move away from the slides at that time so we can see each other. I would hope, if you are willing, that you would allow us to see your face and have your videos to allow that when we come to the Q&A and the discussion period. Look, here is my email. I share that at the bottom simply because I've gone to lots of workshops and done them for years and know that some of the best questions usually happen about 2 hours after the session's over or the next morning. And so if you have questions, Fred knows how to be in touch with me, but you can also just email me at tedbowman71@gmail.com. Just a bit more to add to what Fred said, and then let's jump into the material. I'm a grief and family educator based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have been doing this work with families and individuals and organizations and communities for over 40 years now. And so I specialize in change and the disruptive changes of our lives and the resulting transitions that we make as we move from one thing to another. And I use stories quite much in my life and my work as well. For your information also, I became a widower a little over 3 years ago in the midst of the pandemic, early in the pandemic in July 2020. My wife of 41 years and I had just celebrated our 41st anniversary, had taken a little bit of a quarantine in the midst of the pandemic. And it was quarantine even then, but just to get away up to Duluth, Minnesota, where we shared some stories, looked at our futures, talked about our health, our well-being, our plans for going ahead, not knowing, that within 48 hours of coming home, she would call from the other room, there's a pain in my chest, and was dying of cardiac arrest, a very sudden death. So I come wearing the hat of a widower along with many of you. Just let me share the connection I have with you with a little piece that I wrote about 6 months after Marge died. I was struggling with the words now applied to me. I was a widower. And that's a relatively new word that we don't talk about it a lot, but it's lovely to have a word. Because if you have a child die, there's no word, there's no phrase. If you have a sibling to die, there's no word or no phrase. If a parent dies, there's no word or a phrase. But we've had this word widow and widower for decades and much longer. And so I was glad to have a word, but I was struggling with what did that mean now for me, a widower. I was also thinking of myself as a single man for the first time, as I said, in 41 years. I was a solo man. And I shared this with a male friend, and I hope that you could take advantage of the National Widowers Organization and the Men's Grief Network for support. I shared this with a man friend of mine, my consternation about these words. And he said, Ted, you've never been single. And I looked him in the eye and I said, please don't jerk me around. This is hard enough. Don't play with me about this. I'm struggling. He said, Ted, we've been friends for 25 years. During those 25 years, you've talked about your earlier 25 years. Ted, you have always had a collection of people, family, friends, and others at a part of your life. I've been a part of that collection for 25 years. Ted, I'm not leaving your collection. Ted, you are not single. It was just this lovely reframing. It didn't change anything. I was still a widower. But he reminded me that I had a chosen group of people, and some family, yes, but friends and even people like you attending the session today who would be part of my collection and could enrich my life as I go forward. I hope we can do that in the next 45 minutes. So let me just move through some slides quickly to inform the session. Laguna woman, Leslie Silko from the Southwest, a Native woman, says you don't have anything if you don't have the stories. Now, she talks as a marginalized person, a Native woman here in America, and is addressing people like me, Caucasians, immigrants from other places. So their evil is mighty. They would like to take away our stories, let our stories be forgotten, but you don't have anything if you don't have the stories. What a powerful statement about the power of stories. Henri Nouwen, a theologian, says stories and words are ambiguous. Someone might read what I wrote, he wrote, and discover something there that I myself did not see, but what might be just as valid as my original thought. That's the power of bibliotherapy, poetry therapy, writing. You read a book, you hear a song lyric, someone shares an aphorism, and it begins to have some efficacy for you. And so I'm not presuming that all I say today will be your truth, but it may prompt you to think about your own words. And then I love the piece at the bottom from Frederick Buechner. If I tell my story anything like right, the chances are that you will recognize that it is in many ways, it is also yours because it's a human story. That's what I hope for the day's session. Here's a poem from the 13th century, a Middle Eastern poet by the name of Rumi. You see his name at the bottom there. And it's a metaphor. I'm going to talk about metaphors and storytelling. And he has this haunting metaphor. This being human is a guest house. How about that? This being human is a guest house. And then he says, every morning, a new arrival. And then I love it. He has an arc of life, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. As I said earlier, mine happened in July 2020 when Marge called from the other room. There's a pain in my chest, an unexpected visitor. Didn't expect her to die that quickly. She had no history of heart disease in that way. But look at the next line of the poem. And that's, again, what I want to invite you to embrace with me today. It was countercultural in the 13th century and still is here today. Welcome and entertain them all. Not welcome in the sense of spin or rose-colored glasses, not look on the bright side, but rather even something tragic, even something I wish had never happened. How do I embrace that? How do I meet that? How do I marshal my resources to begin to live as a widower? That's what I want us to explore a bit today. Now, let me encourage you to talk about this. Here's a story that's similar to Rumi's in some ways. In this case, a grandfather had died, and a grandson, about 8 years of age, came over to his granny's house a few days after the funeral and asked one of those questions that seemingly 6 and 8 year olds are really skilled at asking. He said, Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa? Or do you never want to talk about Grandpa? How's that for a question? It's probably the question that comes to us. Do you want to talk about being a widower? Or do you not want to talk about being a widower? And so the granny, I think she's quite wise in this one, said cautiously, there are times when I need to talk about him very much, when it helps me. But there are other times when I feel that I can't, either because it hurts too much or because it feels private at that particular moment. But on the whole, I want to talk. So the grandson sat and digested this in silence, and then looked at his granny and says, I see. So it's all right to do what you feel like, right? And she was a bit reluctant to say a firm yes, but she did kind of say a tentative yes. And he said, I'm ready. Let's talk about him. That's what I hope might happen with you, that these kind of stories might cause you to think about how you might want to share some of your story with others, even to call a friend, to attend a support group, and to say, this is what's happening to me. Would you just listen for a few minutes? So what are we talking about? We're talking about loss and grief. If you ask people to free associate around the words grief and loss, they will often, about 65% in research says something about death and dying. But look at the definition. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. What have I already mentioned in the session so far? My role changed from being a spouse, a partner, to being a widower. I also lost a person who shared her opinions with me about dinner plans, about what to do today, about our life trajectory. And so I lost those opinions. I lost a way of life of being a married man for 41 years. She's not here in the apartment right now, and yet she is here in this apartment right now. Think of all the losses, the storyteller, the comedian, the one who did certain kinds of tasks. And so we experience the loss not only of the person, but of all the kind of activities that are connected to that person. And loss comes first, and then grieving response is a whole body response to loss. And that's even confusing because it is whole body, as you see the 4 bullets there. It is emotional, the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger, but it's also cognitive, being overwhelmed, confused. How do I do this? How do you do a funeral in the midst of the pandemic? Do we have enough money? All of those kind of cognitive, informational requests that we have. It's a spiritual response to loss. What kind of world? Does this seem fair? How could this happen to her? All of those kind of meaning-making questions. And it's a visceral response to loss. Why am I so tired? I'm just not thinking clearly these days. And that can happen certainly soon after a death, but also can happen for me here 3 years later, that I will have some days where I'm just weary. Did I not sleep well? Do I have something stressful on my plate today? Or am I grieving Marge's death? Am I grieving the state of my life right now in whatever way I might? And certainly some of that means happens because, as Colin Murray Parks, a British colleague, says, all of us from the moment of our birth have built inside ourselves a model of the world, a set of assumptions that we use each day to plan our behavior. But look at the underlying part. Anything which challenges our assumed world, this model of our world, incapacitates us. Marge and I had even talked about that we were of an age that one of us would probably die in the next decade for sure. But we didn't expect it. I didn't expect it to happen 48 hours later of that conversation. And there have been times when I've been incapacitated, wondering, how do I do this? How do I do this? A lot of my work has been around also what I wrote about, what I call shattered dreams. Losing an emotionally important image of oneself, one's family, one's life, one's work, even one's death, losing the possibilities of what might have been, abandonment of plans for a particular future, the dying of dreams. Here's a poem that Jane Kenyon wrote that gets at the anticipation of these kinds of shattered dreams. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. There's the assumed world. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood. All morning I did the work I love, just going through an assumed day, our regular routines. And the poem ends, I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the wall, Plan another day just like this day, but one day I know it will be otherwise. Oh my. I'm guessing if when we come to move away from screen sharing, that some of you can give me the hour, the day, the month, and the year that became otherwise for you when you became a widower. There we are. So in the midst of that, that can create ambiguity. Pauline Boss has written eloquently about it. And she says that, look at the part there toward the bottom. What is distressing us? And she's writing, in this case, about the virus, the pandemic, but we could talk about widowhood. We could talk about loss of job. We could talk about divorce. What is distressing us is not just whatever's occurred, but the ambiguity surrounding it, what we will do, what we should do about it. And then she describes a lot of men. Science provides some answers, but we're experiencing uncertainty, and that's very stressful for a society, for a man, for a family, for a business that is accustomed to solving problems and having definitive answers. I'm guessing if you're anything like me, you're experiencing some ambiguity about widowhood and how best to do it. So here are some examples of stories of change. You may know the Joan Didion book, The Year of Magical Thinking. She and her husband had come home from their usual work in New York, had begun to have a glass of wine and some snacks before dinner. And she suddenly becomes aware that the other side of the room was quiet, and there he was slumped in his chair. Life changes fast. Life changes in an instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. I don't know if yours was sudden or prolonged, but it happens. C.S. Lewis, Oxford Don in England, knew lots about everything, married a woman late in his life, and then she died. And everyone thought that if anybody could talk about it well, understand it, it would be C.S. Lewis. But look what he wrote. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow turns out not to be a state, but a process. There's something new to be chronicled every day. Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley. It goes on and on. Julian Barnes uses metaphors. Grief configures time, also space, and you enter a new cartography. You need new maps for your life. And then he uses these metaphors. I've entered the desert of loss, the lake of indifference, the bog of self-pity, the caverns of memory. Many people who are grieving don't use straightforward words. I'm in over my head. This sucks. I don't know how to do this. It's just a roller coaster. We all use those kind of phrases and words to describe. Those are what we call metaphors, words of imaging. And so it's we need to follow each other and ask, tell me more about falling into the hole. Tell me more about the roller coaster. We might even ask that of ourselves. And so what I'm describing here as I move forward is that throughout life, we have to reauthor our lives. Tom Attic, a grief educator, asserted that especially after bereavement, people describe a process of relearning their world. And narrative therapist Michael White from Australia talks about the concept of reauthoring stories. Effective therapy, he asserted, we can do self-therapy, is about engaging people in the reauthoring of the compelling plights of their lives. How do we begin to reauthor our lives? Sheryl Sandberg, she became, in her case, a widow, not a widower, said that a childhood friend had helped her, a rabbi, a friend had helped her soon after her husband died, when he said that the most powerful one-line prayer that he ever read was this: let me not die while I'm still alive. Let me not die while I'm still alive. And then she says, I never would have understood that prayer before losing David, her husband. Now I do. I think when tragedy occurs, it prevents a choice. You can give into the void, the emptiness that fills your heart, your lungs, constricts your ability to think or even breathe, or you can try to find meaning. These past 30 days, so this is recent for her, I've spent many of my moments lost in that void, and I know that many future moments will be consumed by the emptiness as well. But when I can, I want to choose life and meaning. She's beginning to reauthor her story. I want to choose life and meaning. And so what I'm describing is that throughout our lives, we story and restory involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. Judith Viorst shared a little story about a little boy. I love the story. My mom says I'm her sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a wonderful, special, terrific little guy. I'm just had another baby. Why? If you're the firstborn, you're the king or the queen, and someone dies, the story changes. We had a boy knock at our door years ago and say, "Would you like a baby?" When I opened the door, I thought he was talking about a gerbil or a hamster, a cat or a dog. He said, "My mother's pregnant. We don't need another one." He was beginning to story and restory. We do it throughout all of our lives. So all of this is background for, I want to talk with you about using other people's stories. So when you attend support groups, they will use both direct and indirect methods in grief care. Direct methods are those that invite the person to tell or address their own story, what we call open questions, life review, nostalgia, those kinds of methods. Indirect methods include the use of prompts, someone else's words, poetry, memoir, other sources, song lyrics, to elicit reactions and comments and stories. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to emphasize the indirect methods, urging you to consider writing or in support groups to tell your story and invite others to share theirs. So several principles that lead to this. If something is unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Understanding is more important than agreement. You and your siblings, other members of the family, may have differing reactions to the death of your spouse, your partner, someone else. People often assume that everyone shares the same story when there's a death at a funeral, but there are multiple reactions because we all had different relationships with the person who's died. And then there at the bottom, how things are handled is often more important than what happens. So it's not just widowhood, but how do I do it? And are there ways I can do this a bit better? So I'm talking about what's called bibliotherapy. You may know about art therapy, dance therapy, music therapy, and the like. And so it's what's sometimes called poetry therapy. It's simply to use other people's words to evoke your own stories. Since stories evoke stories, the use of stories in grief work is for the purpose of prompting responses from the grieving person. Here's an example of that kind of writing. Anna Quindlen in the New York Times wrote years ago, "The world loves closure, loves a thing they say that can be, as they say, be gotten through. That is why it comes as a great surprise to find that loss is forever." Lots of people don't want to hear that. But what it means is that 2 decades after the event, 30 years after the event, there are those occasions when something in you cries out at the continual presence of an absence. Ooh, what a phrase. The continual presence of an absence. So we don't, as we used to talk about grief as getting over it, moving on. What we've learned about grief is that we learn to live with loss, that there will be reminders, as Anna Quindlen says so well, from time to time. You think you are going through having a grand day, and all of a sudden a song comes up on the radio, or you smell something in a restaurant, or someone says some phrase or looks in a certain way, and there you are, reminded of your dead wife or spouse, your partner. And so all of those things that prompt us to think about our own losses. So these are metaphors. And Paul Rosenblatt says that metaphor is the most underdeveloped and under-researched part of grief and bereavement care. And so a few years ago, a colleague and I put together a book called The Wind Blows, The Ice Breaks, Poems of Loss and Renewal, in this case, of Minnesota poets. And here are just 4 examples of people using metaphors to describe grief in their life. Grief never leaves, only changes. It waits outside doors, keeps a place at the table. Think about the metaphor that we talk about of the empty bed, the empty house, the empty table. Richard Solly is direct, and yet what's he saying? One morning cereal, the next day cancer. The assumed whirl is turned upside down. One morning cereal, the next day cancer. Hyde Erdrich, disaster sucks all the air from the room, swing shut doors to our brains' corridors. I'm just not thinking clearly. Oh, I wish she was here to help me to think this through. Got to make this decision. Wang Ping, all I have is a broken voice, a heart immense with sorrow. All of these are persons trying to find words for some of the losses of their lives. And here's a longer piece by a local woman here in Minnesota, Janet Yolen. And yes, she's a widow, but I think she has insight for you and me as widowers. Grief is not getting easier, but becoming more ordinary, as if I've always carried this stone in my breast, calling it a heart. Grief is part of the broken heart. Grief is not going away, just not arriving in tsunami force, the kind of, where it takes the breath away or coming to grips with another change. Rather, it's a steady high tide, which makes me wonder about the rocks below. Is there more to come? Have I done all of the major grieving? And then I love this third stanza. Grief is not a one-time thing, not several days, weeks, months, but is a visitor who's moved into my house for good and occasionally helps out around the house. That someone will bring the Minnesota hot dish. Someone will come and help me to sort through some of Marge's papers and clothes and so on. And grief is not unwelcome here. Here she's beginning to redo her story, for it reminds me of how much I have lost and how blessed I was to have so much to lose. What a lovely changing of her story. So here's a model, and if you've attended other sessions with Fred or Sherry or some of the people in the National Widowers Organization, you may be familiar with this. It's what we call a dual process model, an oscillation model. And I would wish that you could see arrows going back and forth between the two circles. What I've been talking about so far, with emphasis, but also about the right side, is the left side, the loss orientation. It's the requirement that we do some grieving work in being a widower, to embrace, as I said earlier with the Rumi poem, the intrusion of grieving. And we might at times deal with a denial and avoidance of restoration. I can't do that yet. I'm not ready. That's a big step. I remember a friend whose partner had died, and they had met at a venue here in the Twin Cities where live music was being played, and there was even dancing and so on. They enjoyed that for the first 3 years or so of their marriage, and then she died. And so a friend came over one day and said, and he was sharing, I've lost not only the person, but I've lost music. And the person said, you had music in your life before she came. You had music before she left, she died. You'll have music for the rest of your life. Let's go and hear some music. He wasn't sure that he was ready to hear that again. There's the denial, the avoidance of restoration changes. But we need to be able to oscillate at times over to give it even a try, attending to life changes, doing new things, distraction, new roles, new identities, moving in a different kind of direction, and so that we can move ahead as we do that. Here's my way of writing about Marge's death in my most recent book, and it moves between these two circles. It's a brief little piece called I Will Color This Time. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. There's the grieving. I will reach for brilliant, bold, bright colors and beiges, blues, and blush. I yearn for an array of color similar to the rainbow of flowers sent so soon after her death, the loss again, reminding me of the colorful life that we shared and that I can still have. It's a poem, it's a piece about this oscillation, dual process of moving from one circle to another. So just a couple more, and then going to move to some discussion with you in just a few moments. It does not seem to be the case. This is examples of hope prompts as we move ahead toward healing. This is from Nell Noddings. It does not seem to be the case that joy and grief can occur simultaneously, but they can occur alternately within nanoseconds of one another. It may happen that even in the deepest grief, I can still see and feel joy there, that I had 41 years with Marge. Wendell Berry talks about tools. So when despair for the world grows inside me, I go into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief, and I come into the peace of still water. I go outside, I look up into Mother Nature, have no thought of grief, and I get better. It's healing. So what's healing for you? Is it music? Is it being with friends? Is it having a stability in your life of work and friends and going fishing, summer activities? The Minnesota State Fair started today. If you were here, would you want to go to the Minnesota State Fair? Would that be a healing? Reminding you, yes, of a person who was your companion in past years, but you can still go there. And then Anais Nin at the bottom, and the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. Can you allow yourself to move over to the restoration side, to move forward? And then finally, this one poem, Denise Levertov, that fits for me on many days. I have only one small grain of hope. And then she urges me, and I say I need more. I break off a fragment because of this poem to send you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink. Please share your fragment so that yours will grow. Only by division will hope increase. Hope is contagious. So I'm hoping in just a few minutes that you will share some of your own wisdom and we can learn from one another. So here are 4 of the things that I've written. In case you are interested, they're available at Amazon or places like that, or you can contact me through the email I gave you earlier, just in case you want to read any of these kinds of things. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And if you will, open your videos so that we can begin to see each other. And as you are doing that, I'm just going to read a couple things that I have written, again, to prompt you to some of your questions and to say the importance of our words, that we might share some of these with one another. This is a piece that I wrote soon after Marge died. Grief was sudden. Cardiac arrest doesn't stand in a queue waiting for a vaccine. She died as she cried, pain in her chest, panic in mine. I held my dying wife, seeking life, grasping for what was happening, only to discover that she was going somewhere else. I needed just to put to words what happened that night when she called out to me and began to move forward. Then in the winter of 2020, so after she had died, I began to write this, A Widower's Lament. Whatever it was I thought my 70s would amount to, I was wrong. I pictured a slowing pace, more want-to choices, the good life of the later years, less busy perhaps, yet still energized. The old notion of live fully as you can for as long as one can. I did picture more routine deaths of friends, grief I knew would accompany us, nature's way of thinning the herd, reminder of deep ties. But I hadn't pictured her death, not yet, and the way it happened. Who could imagine? So I was going on, speaking to my life review, whatever it was I thought my later years were going to be. I didn't exactly picture this, and especially so soon. So quick. And so would use these kinds of pieces to begin to address some of the issues of my own life. I'll share more if you wish, but let's open it up. You can unmute yourself so that we can hear you and hear your questions.
Okay, I will allow people to start. There are a couple that have their hands up. There was one question that came in.
Sure.
What why did you choose this outlet, writing, as opposed to some of the other things that you could have done?
Okay. Yes, I'm glad you raised it that way. One size does not fit all. For some people, it's going to be music. For some people, it's going to be exercise. It's going to be body care. It's going to be being with friends and support groups and so on. But throughout my life, and this is in the beginning of the Ambiguous Parables book that I just showed you, the collected prose and poetic pages herein are the voice of a man seeking greater comfort with ambiguity. What seems to be is not always what is. A lifelong quest has been to find words, the words of others through conversations, poetry, song lyrics, fiction, nonfiction, scriptures, or my own words to acknowledge and address ambiguous experiences. So some of you are saying, oh, Ted is a word nerd. And so in some ways, that's right. I've always been searching for words to describe confusing things and writing little stories. I wrote about a bicycle ride when I was in my childhood, and my pant leg got caught in the bicycle chain, but it was my school pants. And so I knew I could not rip my breeches, we used to call them, my pants, or my mother would be very angry. And so I walked all the way home with my pants caught up in the chain so that I would not rip my pants. So all I'm telling you is I'm a story gatherer, a storyteller. And part of this, what got reinforced to the person's question is, as I began to do work around family changes, birth of a child, raising an infant, moving to adolescence, I began to hear stories that matched what I was reading in fiction, seeing in movies, was hearing in song lyrics. And I began to realize that stories work. And so that became part of my own healing, but also I use them in my work.
Okay. We've got John Doty who raised a question. I'm asking him to join us.
John, are you willing to unmute and just say it?
Here we go.
Unmute yourself. I see the red is still there. Just unmute and then let's hear your question, John. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not too good at the hardware and the software. You'll have to excuse me. I really don't have a question. I just hit the wrong button. But I thought the presentation was really extremely well done, particularly the thought of this isn't going to go away. And naively, I never really gave too much thought to it, but I've been a widower for 5 years, May 18th.
Okay.
And I'm no better off today than I was 5 years ago. I've got a local grief counselor. I'm actually involved with a hospice in Florida that has a grief counseling team.
Okay.
My wife actually knew the grief counselors.
Uh-huh.
I mean, how many times has that happened?
Yes.
But with all that, it has not seemed to do. I'm still not with it.
Okay.
I'm just not.
What you're describing, John, is what some of us who do this kind of grieving work call continuing bonds.
Continuing bonds.
Continuing bonds. And it's similar to what you said about that it goes on, the continual presence of an absence. And the continuing bonds is that we, in effect, if I can say the words, we bury the dead, we have the funeral, but we then move them to a different place in our lives. They're no longer physically present and alive, but they have left their mark on us. We've shared life with them, values, we've done things. And so we're imprinted with whatever our experiences were with these partners and spouses. And so that's the continuing bonds. We began to take them with us along the way. And so just as I have done with my own parents, to say, I wonder what my dad would advise. I wonder what mom would say about this. I do the same in terms of Marge. I've got to make this decision. Let me hear her voice. And so that's the continuing bonds. Yes, I miss her and it causes some grieving, but I'm also smiling. And so glad that I had 41 years with her, because I can imagine what she would say. And so I
Yeah.
still have some of her wisdom and her life with me. So that's
Yeah.
what I mean by continuing bonds.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like
Okay.
that. We were married 60 years.
Okay. You've got a lot of memories and a lot of
Yeah.
marking. Yes.
Yeah.
William, are you wanting to say something?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I really appreciate your presentation here. And yeah, I was married, my wife and I were married 47 years. And I retired in 2019 and moved to Florida, where we were going to spend our lives together. We moved in October, and January of 2020, she was diagnosed with lymphoma cancer,
Oh my.
and it was a year-long period of suffering, just radiation, chemo treatments. She fell, broke her ankles.
Oh,
She eventually it spread to her brain. She had to have radiation in her brain, but the worst part was when she in November they put a breathing tube in her, and the last thing I remember her saying to me was in the bed was she said, I walked in, she was laying in bed, and she says, help me, help me, help me. And I guess I called the nurse or something. They sedated her or whatever, but that's the last words I ever heard her speak,
okay.
because they put a breathing tube in her.
Yes.
And they when they did, she hated anything in her throat, but she pulled it out. And the next day, the doctors or hospital called and said that they were going to put a new one back in, but that they had to tie her hands down.
Yeah.
So that was late in November of 2020, and that whole month, just seeing her, she couldn't ever talk to me.
Right. Yes.
And I always thought, what are you thinking? Because tears would run down her cheeks.
Yes.
And I never knew what she was thinking, and she wasn't able to express her thoughts.
Yes.
So now I have a hard time. I just keep filling in what she thought, and
Yep.
that's
Yep.
where it's at. My son and I always thought she was going to get help and then cured till that last month.
Right.
And doctors said there's nothing we can do.
Right.
My
Yes.
son and I said, well, we have to disconnect her from the support.
Yes. Yeah.
And we did. And we were in a room, and luckily we held her hand when she took her last breath.
Good. Yeah. Yeah.
It just, and you're just, your presentation, just brings back a lot. But just reminds me, 47 years we're married.
Yes.
And through all that pain, that she had at the last month or so, I just go back and rethink, all the good times, months and months and years, the time we had that were good,
Okay.
and that's what I have to try to remember,
Yeah.
the good
Well,
times versus the bad times.
Yeah.
And
What you
it's
just
hard to do, but I do
Yeah.
it.
What you just said, William, is so important. It's a kind of oscillation for you as well, that you're imprinted and so on with the last months and your wonderful caregiving. And when she called help, you got help, and you did the kinds of things that caregivers are supposed to be doing and so on. But that's only part of the story. And so I'm impressed that you are willing to not only acknowledge that caregiving and some of what you learned about someone having the medical experiences that she had, but that's not the story of the 47 years. And lots of people get so focused on how someone died that they have trouble living with the life that they had with that person for however long. And so for you to talk about being able to oscillate between the two images, I think is an important thing of advice for each of us. So thank you, William.
Thank you.
Good. I don't see any other questions, but I appreciate everyone's input. Ted, thank you again for sharing your insights with us. Our objective today, when we created the National Widowers Day, was to raise awareness for the plight of widowers. And I think what you have shared with us today certainly goes a long way in helping us achieve that objective. This evening, we're going to hold another session at 8:30 tonight to help widowers who are raising children after the loss of their spouse. So I invite anyone who's interested in that session to go to our website and register for it. And please, everyone, remember that the National Widowers Organization offers information and solutions to everyone at no cost. So please feel free to visit our website anytime. Thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone.
Yep, good day.